Morning. On behalf of everybody, I welcome you. I don't know who I was going to say on behalf of whom, but I welcome you. We're starting a two-part, as you see, a two-part series on language in our worship. And by way of a very brief added kind of a footnote before you start a conversation, I had somebody come in, and I mentioned this at the 8 o'clock service, I had somebody come in this past week and expressed to me her pleasure that we were going to have this conversation about language in our worship. Because, as she went on to say, you know, all of those old wouldsts and thous and knoweths and all those other old artifacts of language we no longer speak in the vernacular really are a distraction from worship, and she wishes we would get rid of them. And I was surprised because she doesn't go to 10 or the 8 o'clock service. And it's only in the 8 o'clock service that we have that kind of language every other week.
Only half the time.
And even then, yes, every other week we do a Right To service, which has expunged that kind of language. And that is clearly one of the points of emphasis of our current prayer book, was to move us past Elizabethan English, because we don't speak it. Now, it's a related theme, though it isn't really the point that we're going to get to today, but it does relate in that I think Betsy's going to talk to us about welcome and what our language does to welcome all of us and what it does perhaps not to. So I don't think it's unrelated, though it isn't really the force of what Betsy wants to introduce us to today. So Betsy's going to start it. We're going to have a two-part conversation on language, and I'll let her say more about what the specific content of that is in a moment. But Betsy's going to introduce it, and then next week we're going to carry it on. Now, I hope you're leaving a little time for us to converse together, not just be talked at.
Well, if I have any time.
If you, I better get out. So that Betsy can have the conversation she wants to have with all of us. Betsy, thank you.
I'm delighted that you're here today, and we're going to get started very quickly. I'd like to start first with a word of prayer. In thanks to God for this time together and for each person who has come, for our parish community, and for hearts and minds open to the Spirit as we begin a conversation about a subject that may be challenging or a little nervous-making for some. We pray for openness to our own feelings and those of others, as well as to the needs of our parish as we move together toward the future. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Our city band, as you know, has joined Welcoming America and has been behind a whole week of welcoming activities in which a number of our parishioners have taken a very active role. And this year's week was devoted in a special way to immigrants and refugees, as was our Sunday Adult Forum last week. Very well done here. So, welcoming is something that we at Trinity do our best to do well. I believe that our desire to welcome seeks increasingly to reach out in love, to all and all the people around us, as we heard last week's forum with the Neighbor Love Cohort's presentation. We want to be willing to reach out to people that we heard about last week, and not only them, but to many others as well. And changing some of our liturgical language might play a significant part in making this happen. Before I go any farther, I'd just like to check and see how many 8 o'clockers we have here today. Hey, that is terrific. Okay. And I want to tell you that if you're thinking, oh my, I'm afraid of what this is going to bring, please let me reassure you, although my talk has no imprimatur from anybody, that I have no desire to try to change the 8 o'clock service language. So rest easy on that one. Okay. We'll move right along, if I can get used to this technology. Today's topic is inclusive language as a path to welcoming. And it's, as Jed said, it's part one of the series of 2. We look at today's agenda. Today is much more focused on the why we want to look at language in our worship rather than on the what and so forth, but we will also touch on that, the what inclusive language is and its potential impact on our liturgies. And then we will have conversation, and we hope that will take a good bit of our time together, and so I'm hoping to rush through all these slides. So the next slide begins to talk about the why. And I want to start this section out with a personal story of mine and then a personal question for you. And the personal story of mine is that back in 1979, I was in a gathering after worship with a group of people, and the leader, the pastor of this particular group, said to me, "Betsy, your language is awful." 79, believe this, 1979, okay. And I thought, oops, I've really blown it. What am I doing? And I had no idea what I was doing. And then finally it dawned on me, it was because I was trying so hard to be grammatically correct that I kept inserting all these male pronouns throughout everything I'd say. And that really bothered people. This was primarily a group of LGBT people, and there were some people there who were very sensitive to the whole thing of language. And so I knew that I had to learn how to be more sensitive in my own language when I was with others. I don't expect you to have an example quite like that, but I do want to ask you a personal question. And that is, think of a situation in which you felt awkward, as though you didn't belong because of who you are. If you can think of such a situation that relates to language, so much the better, but that's not important. The important thing is that you felt you didn't belong. And if you can't think of any situation like this any time in your life, why do you think that is? I'm going to give you at least half a minute to think about that. Okay, everyone had time to think. Let's move on, and I'd just like to have 2 or 3 people maybe share a brief response. What was the situation in which you felt you didn't belong because of who you are? Or what was it about you that made you feel that way? Or if you couldn't think of any situation like this, why do you think that is? Yeah, Pat?
I'm just so uncomfortable nowadays with the kind of language that's coming from, I don't want to be political, but from an area where, you know, I want to have respect, and I'm very uncomfortable with that language.
Okay, thank you. Marie?
I lived in a town where I was in the minority that was very polarized by religion. And after making a few faux pas, I kept my mouth shut, and I was extremely careful about everything I said, and very intimidated by that I might say the wrong thing.
And okay, so what was it about you? It was because you belonged to that religion and...
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I belong to a minority religion.
Okay. And Pat, do you have a sense of what is it about you that is averse to this language you're hearing?
It's just not how I was taught to respect other people and to speak, and it's
Okay.
It's very uncomfortable.
Anyone else want to respond to the question? Rick?
All right. When I was in college, the summer job, I worked as a gandy dancer in the Portland Railroad yards, and I was the only white person on the crew. One day I inadvertently said, "Okay, boys, let's get back to work." And I was lucky to get out alive from that situation. It was obvious that I knew when I said it in the reaction what I had done, but it never occurred to me at the time I said it that I was going to hurt people's feelings. So I was pretty naive.
Thank you. Is there anybody who couldn't think of a situation like this? I know I'm always hard pressed to think of things on the spot. Okay, Ray or Peggy, do you want to say why you think it is that you couldn't think of anything?
Because I've been naive.
Okay.
Mostly the people that I have dealt with in my life were people I was familiar with, and people who were familiar with me. So, I don't do well with new people.
Okay. Okay, that's certainly another whole class of people that we're looking at as people who have that kind of a challenge.
Well, that's part of my naive, I can't even say the word. Part of the reason why I was naive is because lack of experience.
Do you see any pattern here? We may see a little bit of one as we go along. So patterns often do emerge. Now, you've probably noticed my shirt. Got privilege. Okay. Privilege is defined by people who talk about such things these days because they're interested in confronting the privilege areas that they're coming from. Is defined as the benefits automatically received from being a member of the dominant group. And this can be any dominant group. And we're going to make a list in a minute of the dominant groups we see. But some, Rick mentioned his role in the railroad, and there it was white versus person of color that he was picking up on. Another one that's common for us to look at is male and female. And then there are many, many more. And so what I'd like to do, if we could, just briefly, is make a list of privileged and disadvantaged, what I'm going to call disadvantaged. Other people would use the word oppressed, which is a little stronger, and I'm going to leave it a little gentler for you all. But these are both words to take into consideration, because some people are getting the break and other people are not. So a little klutzy here. That could be another disadvantaged group we could talk about.
Two left-handers
Okay, I'll get out of your way.
to move this.
And so, do you want to just mention some groups that you feel are privileged as opposed to other groups?
Well, in this country, wealth.
Kathy.
certainly.
Well, on the disadvantage, I would say people with disabilities,
Okay.
because they become invisible. People do not want to look at them.
Okay, and then what would be the privileged counterpart?
Without disabilities, no issues.
Able-bodied.
Able-bodied.
Okay, something else.
I would say educated as opposed to less educated.
Okay,
When we mentioned wealth earlier, I heard someone say wealth versus poverty.
welfare?
Wealth.
Wealth.
And
Okay,
poverty.
wealth and poverty, thank you.
I think I would agree with that.
Celine.
Females working in male professions.
Okay,
It's wage
you can use symbols for that one.
Because I used to be a science teacher, and in those days, there weren't many women.
Okay, good. Sue?
Young versus old.
Which is on top?
Yeah, well, yeah, right.
Well, that depends.
The thing that I notice when I go downtown now, I'm always holding the door open for young people who are crashing through, and I'm invisible. So I think that a lot of my friends.
Okay. Okay, good. Anything else? There are a lot of other factors. How about what we've been talking about all week in regard to immigrants and refugees? What about immigrants versus native born?
Well,
That means all of us are immigrants.
Yeah, well, that way,
We're not native born.
Well, it could go either way. There was a very interesting talk Friday night at Ben Church, Methodist Church, and they talked a lot about this, and one of the things was they asked people what date, to think of what date their people had come here. So just think for a minute, what date your parents' parents had come, or your parents' parents' parents, or whatever it might be. If it was before 1924, then they got in with no papers. Okay, so any of us in that category, how many are in that category with parents before 1924? Okay, so our ancestors came here undocumented. Okay. Then starting in 24, there were a few quotas set up, and it said that 70% of the people that came in during that period came from the UK or Germany or one other country. I don't know. Ireland. Okay. During that whole period, those are the three groups. There's a big influx. And then after that, the quota system stayed in place, and then it was 1965, I think she said, that we began really setting this up in a way that very much disadvantaged some, almost making it impossible for them to come without documentation, like people from Mexico, for example, and still making it easy for others, and especially people of any means. So,
would you put, I don't know if it's covered in that, but legal, illegal?
okay, documents, no documents, because we have them now, and we have to carry them around.
And along with that, language is a very important.
Okay,
If you speak English versus anything else,
okay.
Or just an accent?
fluent unaccented English puts you in a privileged group.
Now, there's one thing that we didn't mention up here except for the working situation, but the male-female thing, which is something that comes out very strongly when you're looking at language. Because of the way our language was constructed, where we're all supposed to say, if somebody wants to get that book, let him go get it. It's automatically a him that slips in there, and it just comes so easily that we don't even notice it's happening. So there are many, many different places that where some people have privilege and other people don't.
We don't have heterosexual and LGBTQ.
Oh,
either.
good, thank you. That's definitely
I
another
would
one.
say gender, what's the right word, gender identity,
Well, it would be sexual orientation and gender identity, but it could also be LGBTQ and heterosexual, or
Straight, gay,
whatever way you want to put that.
sexual, I'm trying to make it short.
I know.
Just go with the letters.
The heterosexual.
Beauty has privilege.
Yep.
And I think that unusual looking people have a disadvantage. Yes.
Appearance,
Okay.
It's such a subjective term.
Betsy, what about just light skin color versus all the others?
That makes an amazing difference. Have you ever been in Mexico and looked at the billboards and wondered why everybody on a billboard
It's white.
is white?
Same thing is true in Nicaragua.
and India.
Okay, all good things to speak of, all bad things to suffer from the other side of. So, talking about privilege and disadvantage or oppression, which is another word often used, as I said, is a frequent topic of conversation, especially among white people who are seeking to address the racism that tends to persist in us even as we struggle against it. This statement does not reflect personal culpability. The problem is systematic and institutionalized and often unrecognized. It's just doing business as usual. But it often appears in places like our language and our other ways of interacting, which brings us full circle to the why of today's topic. Why are we talking about language in liturgy? It's important to avoid inadvertently scaring people away as they come to be in touch with their own oppressions and recognize that they feel excluded by things they'd never acknowledge as a problem. For example, that male imagery dominates our understanding of ourselves and of God. and who are women involved. Many women, including myself, up until recent years, never recognized this. And we were sort of happy. I wasn't happy in the kitchen. I was never the barefoot and pregnant type. But which many women, a role that many women assumed quite comfortably because it's just the way it was. But it was still there. And many women find that the domination of male imagery in our liturgy undermines their sense of self-worth vis-a-vis the men that they are with. And it limits all of us in our appreciation of imagery expressed along a broader gender spectrum. It was interesting, I was taking a class in ethics at one point in seminary, and the teacher, who happened to be a woman, we were reading these really hardcore feminist stuff. And this is where I first came in touch at all with the oppression of women. And so I was really feeling it, and so were a number of the other women. Who did the professor reach out to? The men. Because she knew that they, too, were really suffering through this, because they had never intended to be oppressors, but it's the way it turned out in society. And so it's very hard to have avoided that, and so it was a reasonable thing for her to do. Anyway, this leads me to the backside of my shirt that challenged all of us. You can't see it very well, but it says in English, "This world will not change unless we are ready to change ourselves." And that was Rigoberta Menchú, who was a Nobel Peace Prize winner from Guatemala, who said that. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about language and what we're doing and using in our church, and looking at our mission as a church to reach out to all people and be loving and welcoming to all. We need to examine what we're doing with our language. So, the what of inclusive language. Oh, okay, this is just my statement. One of the ways I believe we could beneficially improve as a parish community is to make our liturgical language more welcoming. And I just want to put this disclaimer back in if it wasn't clear enough. I am not trying to suggest that we change the 8 o'clock language. Because if we're going to be welcoming to all, we have to be welcoming to those among us. At least that's the way I feel. And there's some people, who here really feels strongly about the language, that you really like the language that you've got in the prayer book? Would be interested in seeing a show of hands.
Say that again, Betsy.
Who has as one of your reasons for going to the 8 o'clock service the fact that you like the language?
Me.
Okay, well, one person said.
Betsy, are we talking strictly Rite One language, or?
Well, Rite One, I would say, would epitomize what we might think of as 8 o'clock language.
But we do Rite Two also, Betsy.
No, I know you do. And so it could be fidelity to the prayer book. You are coming out of the tradition. People who are wanting to change it are wanting to change it. And that's why it's so important for you all to be welcome. And I was just checking to see for whom language was an outstanding reason for their being there. Okay, so we're moving on now to the what. That was kind of the why. If you didn't get it, the why is because we need to do something in order to make everybody feel welcome. And so let's think of 10:15 as we think of that, at least this week. I don't know what they're going to do next week. That's up to them. Okay, so what? Inclusive, what we're talking about, what inclusive language is and its potential impact on our liturgies. And inclusive language is language that's intended to help people feel included, to know that they are welcome. It's the opposite of language that is exclusive, that tends to make some people feel they do not belong. And I have a couple of quotes from a wonderful resource from the United Church of Christ, which they came out with in 1997. I looked in the Episcopal resources and I didn't find anything equal to this, and I have copies of that, 20 copies of that anyway, to hand out if you're interested. The use of only masculine nouns and pronouns for God and of masculine generic terms for humankind has hidden the rich feminine imagery for God and God's people in Scripture. And they go on to say, inclusive language is far more than an aesthetic matter. It's a fundamental issue of social justice. Language that is truly inclusive affirms sexuality, racial, and ethnic background. I'd like to give you a couple of examples and clarifications and resources. Jeremiah and the Jewish question are not related to each other, but they are both questions that have arisen here at Trinity just in recent months. Jeremiah, there was a passage from Jeremiah read at a Wednesday chapel service. And Jed, and I have to mention Jed here because Jed has been doing a really good job of trying to make things inclusive. And he's trying to balance the interests of everybody and so on. But he has been working hard at it. And this was the Jeremiah passage where Jeremiah is first called to be a prophet. And he says, oh God, no, I can't do it. I am only a boy. And Jed took that out and put child instead of boy. Because it didn't make any difference in that case what gender this person was. What made a difference was his age. So we were looking at age and not gender there, and so we used that. So that was Jeremiah. And one of the resources, this book is an excellent resource because it has 4 parallel translations of the entire Bible, including the Deuterocanonicals. And so that's the NRSV, which is what we use, the Revised English Bible, the New American Bible, and the New Jerusalem Bible. Those last 2 are Roman Catholic. They're good translations too. So 2 of them said in that particular case, I'm only young. I'm too young. And the other one said, I'm a child. So this is a very handy tool to look at if you're looking for alternatives. So that's Jeremiah. And then the Jewish question, which is completely unrelated. And I have another handout here on that, which I'll pass around now just so you can see it. These are... Okay, thanks, Rick. There are... this is Good Friday. And this really stood out this past Good Friday to me as I was listening to Gay reading the Passion. Jews, 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 over and over and over again. And if you look at this piece of paper, you will see that I've circled the uses of the word Jews. And the book that the other translation is from is this one. This is an inclusive Bible, the first egalitarian translation. This was done by Priests for Equality, a Roman Catholic group. And they did a very good job. This is the whole Bible, and it's also available in lectionary cuttings in the Roman style. So Jews was also, in the inclusive language, instead of Jews, they used they used the people, they used the temple authorities, and they used the crowd. Because the Jews varied, and to say Jews, 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 Jews is just hammering at people with this word that reeks of anti-Semitism. And they weren't talking about the same group of people. They were talking about the whole crowd as the Jews, and they were talking about the Jewish leaders as the Jews. And so it really raises that whole question of anti-Semitism, and that's one of the areas that we want to be working on. So those are 2 quick examples. Another question, is it inclusive or expansive? Inclusive is the sort of umbrella word for language that we use to try to become more inclusive. Expansive is a word that is widely used in Episcopal circles as well as UCC and others for language referring to God, because God doesn't really need to feel included the way we do. And expansive gives a sense that there are many other names that we can call God than Father and He. We don't have to picture this old white man with the long beard as being God. We can get rid of that image. I don't think they're walking out, I think they have to go usher. So, the next thing, okay, that's that one. Then the pronoun problem is one that may affect us in our own language, because it's so hard not to say, oh, why, you're talking about just anybody, and you say, why doesn't he do that? It just comes out. And it's not meant as an insult to men to pull back that language, but it's intended to include everybody. And so there are a number of different ways suggested for addressing the pronoun problem. Avoid generic gendered pronouns by using the second person, you, rewriting in the plural, leaving out or replacing the pronoun, using his or her together, or mixing singular and plural. There's two that I just want to mention here very briefly. One being the mixing, well, at least I'll mention the last one. Mixing singular and plural is awkward for us. I could never do that, and that's why I was always using that language. And now the Oxford Dictionary has said it's okay to say, let a person take up their cross to follow Jesus. So you can mix that, the singular and the plural, and it's okay. So you've gotten your blessing on that. You want to invoke the blessing.
And I wonder if there's a sixth alternative, just throwing it up there. I mean, I see it written in writing from time to time, and that's to alternate between male and female pronouns. I mean, it's offensive to a certain way of thinking about how the language should be used, but to use in one paragraph feminine pronouns, and in the next paragraph to use masculine pronouns if it's a generic kind of a writing. I see it done. I don't know that it's satisfactory, but at least it's another alternative.
I've heard that done, and it could well be added to that list. The problem with that, or the problem with using his or her, is because you're limiting it to a binary gender definition, identity. And many people are quite uncomfortable with that and would prefer eliminating it. Celine?
If you're speaking about a specific person, biblically, who we know is male, why not use the name of the person and then the pronoun that goes with that name?
That's fine. I don't think anybody's arguing with that.
Okay.
The Inclusive Bible will use that kind of language. And this Inclusive Bible isn't by any means the only one that's out there now. There are a lot of others coming out of different sources. Okay. These are just a couple of quotes, again, from the UCC document, and I'll let that be passed around too as I'm talking.
It occurs to me on the issue of anti-Semitism, part of our problem, and it's a serious one, is that we've lost the context. The Bible the New Testament was written almost exclusively by Jews. It was an intra-Jewish argument, which the Jews who believed Jesus was the Messiah, lost. And which is why it became two religions rather than one, rather than remaining one. And we have lost that context. So we assume that John, a Jew himself, was opposed to Judaism. He was not. He lived and died a Jew. His argument was with Jews who rejected Jesus as the Messiah, not with Judaism. And the same thing is absolutely true with Matthew and with Mark. And since we've lost that context, we interpret that in a kind of anti-Semitic way, which is an historical mistake based on a conceptual error about what was actually going on. And it seems to me we need to recapture that context through very careful and widely spread education about just exactly who was writing this stuff. I can say all kinds of nasty things about the United States of America and the current administration, which, if we lose the context, makes me look like I hate America and wish it went down. That would be the opposite of my true belief. And all of us do that. So recapturing context, I think, is one key, not simply, although I do think I applaud this notion of reading, of writing it a bit differently, but the more important task is to recapture the context.
Thank you, Bill. I really appreciate that, and Bill has done a lot of study on these things, and that's a very helpful clarification. And I just want to go back in the same light to the pronoun problem, and again saying, and also the questions like whether you say I am a boy, I'm only a boy, in Jeremiah. One of the most important, if not the most important factor that is to be considered when you're making your choice of which language you use, if it's going to be in a liturgical setting or whatever, is context. Where is it coming from, where is it going, and so on. So where do we start looking at all this stuff? And what do we change? And the first thing that occurs to me is just the parish bulletin. And you'll know if you look in the parish bulletin, if you go to 8 o'clock, you just open it up and it's there and there's nothing that sets you on edge. Fine, that's good. Okay. Now you turn the next page, and right now we're okay because we're using that alternate liturgy, the Iona, and that is good all the way through. But we're going to be changing back to the prayer book soon, and as we can't just see this as a static picture. Because if you look at it, the congregation is evolving. And I think a lot of people in the congregation have a theology and spirituality that is also evolving. And we're not looking at God in the same way. And so when we hear words that put God in the mailbox, well, we're not going to send God anyplace, but when God comes off sounding like a male, it just sounds uncomfortable for many people. So I think we're going to have to be looking at the parish bulletin more fully soon. The lectionary readings are another place, because the lectionary is the one that you got there, showing all the Jews. That is from the Episcopal lectionary that I have at home. I have one that bunches all the paragraphs together, but and it's right there in our materials. So what do we do with that? And can we, I'll leave it to the good clerics next week to figure out how to handle the copyright issues and that sort of thing. But I think for the sake of the people, if we want people to feel welcome at the 10:15 service, I think we've just got to clean up the language and do it, figure out a way. That's my humble opinion here. And then the prayer book, which didn't fit in that little narrow column, has further difficulties in addition to the lectionary. So that will need to be looked at, because that's what we'll be going back to, so that kind of fits in with the bulletin. And then what are we looking at? And I think basically, at least to start with, what we're looking at is gender issues and anti-Semitism. There are other things that you can look at as well, but we can start more simply possibly. And the bottom line for me is to faithfully recognize our call to be welcoming to all in accord with our Trinity mission, and to do what it takes for the language we use to reflect that welcome in accord with our faith and tradition. That is the bottom line. So it's conversation time, and we do have a few minutes before people usually have to scatter. If you have to scatter, that's understood. I would like to ask you to look at some possible conversation starters, but please do not feel bound by them at all. You're free. This is not a language prescribed conversation. And we'd like to know if you can share an example of some language used in our liturgies that leaves you feeling excluded or uncomfortable. And what hopes does this presentation raise for you? Or what concerns it raises for you? So those are just a couple of things, but you can do whatever you want. And so it's your show.
How do we change it, Betsy? I mean, you can't go in and change the prayer book every time you want to do something. I mean, look how it upset everybody when we went from 29 to the next stage. We can't change it every year or every 2 years. How do we handle that?
Well, I picture a loose leaf prayer book when a new one comes out myself. In different congregations can choose different sets of translations and so forth. But the language that is used in the 8 o'clock service, both Rite 1 and Rite 2, are firmly ensconced in our tradition. And it's no wonder that people are attached to them and want to keep using them. And I don't see any problem with that, because it's part of who we are. If we want to be welcoming, we at least have to start with the brothers and sisters who are already here in our parish. But what I am saying is we need to look at ways and how, and we leave it to the people, who work with that sort of stuff to figure out all the details. But if we don't start doing it as Episcopalians in the pew and Episcopalians in the collar, then it's not going to happen. It's not likely to happen from top down. There's so many changes in this world that just don't come top down, and they come because people who are living it live it. And our bishop, we're very fortunate. I have the feeling that from what Bishop Pat has said when he's been here, that if we want to do things that are a little different because we feel that they're going to make it, give our church a chance. Because right now, who's coming in the door that's new? Some people come. Do they stay? Who knows? But we don't want the church to die. We'd like it to keep going. And if we don't start doing things that are going to make it more attractive for people to come in, I don't think we're going to get ahead. And you can change. I mean, Dale and I could sit down and go over a liturgy for a Sunday, and fix it up. Anyway, it's not my part to talk now. Go ahead, Gail.
I think sometimes when we talk about language, I really like that word expansive. I have a priority, and I really do want to welcome people, but at the same time, I don't want what is said to limit God. And our language that we use we've been on the moon. Our language is making God just much, much smaller than we understand God to be today, I think. And I think that's very crucial.
Thank you. Gay.
I really want to be careful when we go back and talk about the Old Testament and to not take away the fact that women in the Old Testament were chattel. And that is in big contrast to today. And similar to what Bill was saying, we need to have educational background to understand how far we've come and where we are now. And we can't do that without that picture of what it was as to what it is now. We can't gender neutrify the entire Old Testament and come away with the fact that women weren't equal to men when that was written.
That's a very good point. I've had the inclination at times to think that we ought to have a notice in our bulletin that says that some of the language you hear in this service may be harmful to your spiritual health. But I don't want to do that because I obviously don't want to offend anybody here. But I think that's something we do have to watch and be mindful and use quotes. Sometimes this inclusive Bible will use quotation marks around, "Are you the king of the Jews?" King of the Jews in quotes, right, rather than just...
And Betsy, if I can just add one thing in relation to what Gay said. This is where, to me, the onus is on the preachers. And it took me a long time to accept that responsibility. And in fact, the guy who's now dead, but I think might still remember it, Ed Key, kind of an irascible, at times unfriendly person, had a huge impact on me, and I'm indebted to him to this very day. He convinced me, like nobody else ever had, that it is the responsibility of the preacher to contextualize not only the scripture, but the language that we use, and in that way to free people. And preaching, if it doesn't happen in the sermon, I don't know where it happens.
Thank you.
So,
That's very good, and I saw one preacher really nodding his head back there, so,
yeah.
yeah, so, thank you. One more comment?
Well, I want to let you carry on the conversation for a couple minutes if you need to, but I want to, because I have to go get ready for the next service, want to geek out just for a moment. Tonight is the premiere of the new Star Trek series. And in terms of language, I might recall for you that William Shatner used to narrate the opening and talk about going where no man has gone before. And every version since, all the other iterations of Star Trek series have said where no one's gone before. Because, as you mentioned from the bottom up, people have been realizing that the language we've used, even at such a mundane level, matters. And so even as I plug tonight's premiere of the new Star Trek series, I hope it's halfway good. Remember to go where no one's gone before. I'll leave you back for the conversation.
Okay, thanks. And we don't have to continue this. I think people should feel free to go if they feel so inclined. It's we still have about 8 minutes before the service starts, so if anybody wants to add a comment and others want to listen, that's great. Somebody add his comment.
Well,
John, yeah.
I was just going to make a point that, and we'll touch on this, I think, next week when we do the whatever you call it, the round table. We're in this process. We have authorized a new prayer book. None of this will be quick. This will be going on for close to a generation before I don't know that I'll see the new prayer book in my lifetime. But we have started, and we don't have the authority just to change. We canonically are required to use our prayer book. And so we're going to have, if we're going to make some change, and we have to use an approved lectionary. Now, and maybe one of the conventions will approve one of these gender-neutral translations. It's not really so much a translation as a change in the use of language. But in the meantime, what we'd have to be careful of is not having a huge disconnect between a gender-neutral lectionary and then the prayer book, because it'll listen today. Well, no, we're using the Iona, but when we go back to the prayer book, language in the prayer book, and you'll be surprised. Yes, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now we can say that Creator, Redeemer, and Spirit, but there are a lot of things that'll have to be worked out. Jesus called God Father. Now, how are we going to handle that? Yeah. There are some real major considerations, and we'll get into this a little bit next week. But all I'm going to do is caution patience. We are moving in that direction. We really are moving in that direction, but I'm not sure we're going to get there quickly.
Thank you.
As quickly as we'd like, anyway.
Anybody else? Thank you all very much for being here. I encourage you to return because there's more to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.